Okay, our first speaker today, Mark Regnerus, is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Texas at Austin and a faculty associate at the university's Population Research Center. He's the author of over 30 published articles and book chapters. His research is in the areas of sexual behavior, religion, and family. His book, Forbidden Fruit: Sex and Religion in the Lives of American Teenagers, tells the story of the sexual values and practices of American teenagers, paying particular attention to how participating in organized religion shapes sexual decision-making. A follow-up book on emerging adult sexual relationships is due out in late 2010. His research and opinion pieces have been featured in numerous media outlets in the U.S. and elsewhere. Forbidden Fruit has been reviewed in Slate, the Dallas Morning News, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and the New Yorker. His op-ed on the benefits of early marriage appeared in the Washington Post on April 26th of this year. He lives in Austin with his wife, Deanne, and their 3 children. Please join me in welcoming Mark Regnerus.
It's good to be with you. It's fantastic to see so many people here. It's also, I was remarking earlier, it's impressive to see so many men. When I usually give talks like this, women usually run 2 to 1 in terms of the kind of people I'm talking to. And so it's impressive to see so many men invested in this movement. And so what we heard last night and what I'm going to talk a little bit about this morning really shows some gender differences, and so it's gratifying to me to see that. Today's talk is an extension of a line of research I have on adolescents and now on emerging adults. So emerging adults, and if you haven't heard that term, it's sort of this reference to people who sort of have not attained full adulthood, and we used to call full adulthood when you were not only under your parents' household, you were through with your education, you had married, you had children, and now that happens later and later, and so we call this sort of stage emerging adulthood, which usually runs 18 to 29, but my data today and in the book will be 18 to 23. So college and the first year of graduate school, if you're in graduate school. So today's talk is an extension of that, but I don't talk a whole lot about religion today, not so much, and not so much in this next book. I think the story was going to be comparable, so I decided in the next book to investigate the nature of relationships more and to explore sort of decision-making in adulthood, which is a little different than when you're a teenager. So what I started to wonder, and this is sort of the outline of the next book, is what are the sexual scripts that emerging adults pick up on? What are their relationships like? And I couldn't really talk much about that in Forbidden Fruit. And teenage relationships tend to be fairly brief. Lots of drama. Thankfully, not a lot of sexual behavior. That is definitely not the case in emerging adulthood, as many of us know and as I will describe. But what are their relationships like? How long do they last? How do they start? How quick are they to become sexual? Things like that. What is the college sex scene like? I mean, there's lots of impressions about it, but I also think, on average, college students are more conservative sexual actors than people who didn't go to college, and I find that's true. I'm not going to talk about that today. You may ask me about it if you'd like. How do people think about marriage, especially in this age bracket of 18 to 23? Are they even remotely aware of it, thinking about it, want to be there? And then fifth here, what about the emotions of non-marital sexual relationships, and how do women and men experience those? There's actually a lot of published research about the effects of clinical depression on sexual functioning, right? Sort of the other way around. But there's not a whole lot on the emotional health consequences of sexual decision-making. A lot of scholars, I suspect, are concerned about appearing conservative or anti-sex. I know several fine scholars who study emerging adult sexual behavior. Their findings are relatively conservative, but they would be hard-pressed to push that point because they don't want to appear conservative to their peers. On the other hand, lots of sexually active emerging adults know what I'm talking about when I talk about emotional consequences. Media scholar Jane Brown from University of North Carolina blames the mass media's unimaginative, monolithic portrayal of sex. She says, quote, "What's typically missing from the media's current sexual script is anything having to do with possible negative consequences of sexual activity." And a lot of social scientists don't even inquire about this. So strong is our mindset about the physical risks of sex, not so much the emotional risks. So let me start this by telling you about Elizabeth. So most of the data I'm going to talk about today are survey research, but there's a handful of interview clips from the National Study of Youth and Religion that I draw upon, and some of my own. I did a study at UT, University of Texas, about 40 students and their relationships. So I'm going to draw upon some of those as sort of color commentary to the survey material I talk about. Let me read this. Elizabeth is something of an enigma. She lives in Boston. She likes clubbing with her friends, meeting men. She's flirtatious. She's fairly sexually permissive in her attitudes. She sort of seems to be trying out the Sex and the City lifestyle that many young women admire and they wonder about. But she doesn't like hooking up. She wants something deeper than that. She said, "I want a serious relationship. I mean, my longest relationship was like 2 months, honestly, which is nothing. That's not like a relationship," unquote. In fact, Elizabeth even considers hooking up a nationwide social problem, which is sort of ironic. She took a pledge of sexual abstinence in high school, but now she thinks that people who marry their first sexual partner may be short-selling themselves. She said, "You need to branch out a little bit, see what else is out there, because then maybe you think he's really the one you want to be with, but because you won't know anything else different," unquote. So Elizabeth's cluster of sort of permissive attitudes, yet with principled objection to relationshipless sex, is fairly common among young women. They're not opposed to sex. Many of them are not virgins, but sex is largely unwanted apart from emotional connection. Many have tried sex without emotion, and they found it impossible or wanting. Elizabeth has hooked up with men before, but she avoided having sex with them, right? This is where you try to figure out, what do you mean by hooking up? Hooking up for her has not involved sex. She said, I quote, "I mean, I would hook up with random stupid people at clubs, and whatever, and it's just stupid." Quote, she recognizes that to have had sex with them would have changed everything. Quote, "When you go that far, it just brings it to a new level. People get into a weird state, and they now expect things." Now, by weird, Elizabeth might actually mean normal, since that's what happens to very many people after sex. They want more. They want more relationship, more sex, more security. People are connectional beings. While we're not trying to reinforce simplistic stereotypes here, it seems obvious to us that emerging adult women are more interested in such connections than men. On average, women want more depth, more exclusivity, more maturity and stability in their romantic relationships than men. Like many emerging adults, Elizabeth both really wants such connections, and yet she's sufficiently socialized into what I call contemporary cosmopolitan gender and sex norms. She's sufficiently socialized in that to verbally disparage the same thing. When asked whether being in a relationship is optimal for sex, she says, quote, "I don't know. I think maybe it's a better idea because then there's emotional attachment and all that other bull. Because then you start getting attached and all that stupid stuff. So I think it's better than when you're involved with somebody but if you don't care, then fine, go ahead," unquote. The problem is getting your heart to care less. In the same interview pool, we tallied up those who had reported sexual regrets. 75% of those who said they didn't have regrets were men. And we pooled the people who did say they had regrets. 2/3 of those who did say they had regrets were women. Now, contemporary research from psychologists is lending itself to some of these interpretations. Not so much sociologists. I'm somewhat of a renegade in the sociology of sex. The sociology of sex, by the way, just doesn't really even exist. I mean, there's the sociology of sexualities, But there's really, in the global sphere of sociology, there's not too many people studying heterosexual behavior. I mean, it's just not glamorous. We want to go for the fringes, not the massive middle. But psychologists have, and I'm grateful to them for several things. On average, they note that women tend to emphasize committed relationships as a context for sex, something I already mentioned. They romanticize the experience of desire more than men. And this is not me talking, these are social psychologists, a variety of them. Their beliefs and behaviors tend to be more plastic than men's. What do I mean by plastic? I don't have the slide here, but on average, women's sexuality is more malleable for a longer period of time than men's. Right? So when you look at teenagers, and especially young adults, more people will be sort of experimenting with bisexuality, that sort of thing, than you'll find among men. Men tend to flatline. I mean, it's more fixed from an early point in time, and it doesn't change much. Women, more of them experiment with same-sex behavior, and then that declines over time, especially during the 20s, and then they wind up with fewer of them than among men, so it sort of crosses. Anyways, it's more plastic than men's. You also see this when people travel and spend time in foreign countries that have different sexual cultures. Women tend to adapt more easily in those kinds of cultures than men. Women tend to feel more guilt about sexual decisions. They do more emotion work over sex. And in fact, psychologists say gender differences in this area are almost more significant and profoundly different than in any other domain. And finally, desire and romantic attachment, they find, may be rooted in distinct spheres of the brain. So, my question for today, primarily, is what are the emotional consequences of, if any, of sexual patterns that we see among unmarried emerging adults? And is it the same for men and women? So what are the kind of emotions that we're talking about here? They can vary widely, but they include diminished self-esteem, a sense of having used someone or having been used, discomfort about having to lie or conceal sex from your family, anxiety over the course or the depth of the relationship, or concern about the role or the place of sex in the relationship. In some relationships, sex sort of emerges rapidly to play this big role instead of the sort of supportive role that it's supposed to play. These are perfectly normal emotions. Many men feel them as well. Others experience more intense versions of these and can include obvious depressive symptoms, crying more than normal, difficulty shaking the blues, and extreme anxiety over the future of the relationship. While the former milder symptoms are important in their own right, I'm going to focus today more on the more intensive symptoms. To be sure, not everyone experiences these kinds of symptoms from their sexual decisions, even the poor sexual decisions that people make. And among many that have, plenty emerge with no long-term effects. But profound or lasting emotional problems are a significant minority event. That's what I want to study. Now, we know this much about depression from the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health, which is now in its third wave, young adulthood. We know that on average, almost 1 in 6 women have been diagnosed with depression. This is not sort of saying, I feel depressive symptoms. This is sort of a clinical diagnosis. Half of those, roughly half of that number, is actively taking antidepressants. The diagnosis is double that of men at this point in time, and the antidepressant usage is triple that of men. Now, scholars suggest that gender differences in such biological response to stressors and coping styles are different. Women are more likely to ruminate, turn inward to deal with distress than men. We see that antidepressants are now the most prescribed drugs in America. Adult use of antidepressants nearly tripled between the early and the late 1990s. Some see this as, hey, we were meeting a need that already existed. Others see more ominous signs about pharmaceutical marketing, as well as concern that doctors are medicating problems that involve a social or behavioral component, not just a chemical imbalance. So most of the data I talk about today comes from this National Study, Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health, Waves 1 and 3. Wave 3 was 2002. It went up to age 27. I'm sort of cutting it off at age 23. Now, this is sort of the working model I have of how sex affects emotional health. Emotional health, as well as its relative absence, is a deep well. The effect of sex on these things is no doubt complex. It involves things that people do, as well as things that have happened to them, things from the past, as well as more immediate actions. So when social scientists start to build a model to try to capture these things, it gets really complex really quickly. You've got things that are more proximate, right? So when I say current sexual activity patterns, that's sort of what I'm focused on. But that's the most proximate thing. That's the thing we see this thing happen, and then we sort of see how they're reacting to it. But we also sort of have early sexual context, like when they lost their virginity, under what circumstances, did they experience sexual trauma, like abuse, have they had an abortion in the past? And family factors, often that's way back in the past, that has led them to a certain point to make decisions that in turn lead them into areas of where their emotional health diminishes, right? So it's sort of complicated. But this is the task to try to get at this. For today, we have 5 self-reported outcomes of interest, so you get a little bit of social science here. The depression scale index, which is fairly common. Crying in the past week. And we did this for both men and women cry more than men, we know that. It's a better measure for women's emotional health status. And it's not always a measure of emotional health problems, but it's one indicator that something could be wrong. Life satisfaction. How satisfied are you with how your life is going? Have you ever been diagnosed with depression, and are you currently taking antidepressants? So this depression scale, the number 1, has different kinds of measures. People were asked, now think about the last 7 days. How often was each of these things true? You're bothered by things that usually don't bother you, right? All of us could. It's been true with my last 7 days. You couldn't shake off the blues, even with help from your family or your friends. You felt that you weren't just as good as other people. You had trouble keeping your mind on what you were doing. Depressed, too tired to do things, sad, couldn't enjoy life, thought that people didn't like you. So this is sort of one way of tapping depression, right? And it's a fairly standard in social psychology. Now, what's going to go into that, right? So we had this this model, right? The trick is to try to figure out how to take predictors, early sexual context, experience of trauma, sexual activity patterns, family, demographics, and put them into a model in such a way that it tells a story. You don't want to dump them all in at the same time, because then this is a pattern that emerges over time, and if you put them all in the same model, you sort of mask those over time effects. So we have a variety of predictors that we're trying to work with. Primarily in this paper, I'm interested in number of lifetime sexual partners, their sort of long-term sexual history, the recent sexual history in the last year, the frequency of sex in the last year. Okay? Standard stuff like age, how much they drink, if they've ever had an abortion or been with somebody who has, was ever sexually abused. It says abused, it should be sexually abused by a parent or guardian up and through grade 6. Whether they have same-sex attractions, whether they had sex before they turned age 16. And then sort of some perspectives about themselves. They think of themselves as intelligent, popular, attractive, self-centered, risk-taker, and a variety of demographic predictors. So we want to look at some simple things first. Okay? Now I'm going to flash a table up here. You'll probably be able to see some of the, if you're a little older, you might have a little trouble with some of the numbers, but I'm going to walk you through it, so don't let it get too intimidating. Okay? All right, what we have here is there are men's scores on the right, women's on the left. So when we look, every time you see a slash, it's women on the left, men on the right. So we look at people who have had 0 sexual partners over their life, 1, 2 to 5, 6 to 10, or 11 or more. Same for the number of sexual partners in the past year. Then we look at the frequency of intercourse that they reported in the past year. Nothing. 1 to 3 times, 4 to 15, blah, 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 all the way up to over 101 times, right? So that's on average once every 3 days. And if they had first sex before they turned age 16. And we look at, so these are simple sort of percentages, right? So the first one you see on the top left means that people who have never had sex, virgins, scored 4.5 on the average depression scale. Okay? People who've had 1 partner scored 4.8, bumping up a little bit. 2 to 5, 4.6, same territory. 6 to 10, 5.4, so they're going up the depression scales. 11 plus partners, 6.2, right? Considerably and significantly higher than people who had 0 or 1. Number of sex partners in last, and this is women only. We see 4.7, but if you bounce down to that the end of that group, 8.6, which means people who've had 11 partners in the last year, which is uncommon, have a depression scale score of 8.6, almost double the number who have had no partners, right? So the same story works across this table, right? People who have had more sexual partners, women cry more almost every day, or are more likely to cry. They're quadruply more likely to cry. Same thing with the number of sex partners in the last year. And you also see that the intensity of this is more for people who've had a lot of partners in the last year than the people who've had a lot of partners over time. Right? So if you look at the 4th column, percent ever diagnosed with depression. People who've had 11 plus sexual partners, 32% of them have been diagnosed with depression compared to 10% of virgins. People who've had 11 plus partners in the past year, almost half of them have been diagnosed with depression. Diagnosed clinically, compared with 12% who have had none in the last year. Same story with taking antidepressants. 30% of those, just about 30%, are taking antidepressants compared to 5% of people of women who've had no sexual partners. Okay? So we see something going on here with women. Now what's the deal with men? The right side of the backslash. Let's take that first upper left-hand corner. We look 4.2, 3.8, 4.1, 4.2, 4.2, nothing going on. We look at the next one, 4.1, 3.9, 4.4, 4.6, 2.9, nothing going on. Really, I mean, it just bounces around. I mean, I don't want to convey that no men feel down or depressed after sex or hookups or relationships that don't last, or that no men find themselves interested in pursuing a deeper relationship with a sex partner, or that men always like their sexual contact with women. That is not true. Some do feel those things. Plenty of others who don't seem to be depressed, nevertheless experience emotional disappointments or longing. Sometimes for men it gets channeled into drinking, which I do not have here, or violence, or slumping grades in college. So some men experience problems after short-term sex that is not reflected in these kinds of outcomes, but it's reflected in other ways. But the deal here is that when we look at these columns, we see that something is going on about women, sexual partners, and emotional health problems, right? But now if we look at the frequency of intercourse in the last year, that third set of rows, right? The story is not nearly so clean, okay? And I'll get to that momentarily. Now, what about if we did more complex statistical models, which I'll point out to you the things of note in those things. I'm not expecting you to understand all of the models. Some of you who have statistics may. But I'll walk you through this, right? We're starting in the model 1 with a sort of a simple model saying, what is the effect of having increasing amounts of lifetime sexual partners, increasing numbers of partners in the last year, increasing levels of sex in the past year, controlling for age, which we should always control for. It's the best predictor of sexual behavior, at least until you're 30, 35. That was a joke. Sorry. All right. So we can see that the number of lifetime sexual partners is associated with a higher depression scale score, regardless of how many sex partners you had in the last year, regardless of the amount of sex you've had in the past year, although the frequency of sex, and this is women only because the last slide said, don't bother studying men on this, there's nothing going on. Okay? So these models are of women. But we also see in Model 2, Model 3, Model 4, Model 5, these sort of past stuff and more stable stuff. Rarer events are significantly associated with depression. Ever had an abortion? That remains significant throughout other models, right? In Model 3, we add that one variable, which is sort of, what was your depression score the first time we talked to you, right? So it's a way of measuring sort of stability in depression as well as change, right? Those things sort of stay stable even though we accounted for whether you were depressed the first time we talked to you or not, right? Same-sex attraction, sexual abuse, and abortion remain significant and predicting greater depression throughout those models. The same thing is true when we look at on crying. Number of lifetime sex partners stays stably associated with crying, regardless of all these other variables, and it stays stable even though we've predicted, well, did you cry a lot when we first talked to you? Just the frequency of crying at wave 1. And people who cry are more apt to cry regardless, right? But we can see that women with same-sex attraction, as well as number of lifetime sexual partners, lends itself to this emotional health expression, regardless of whether they have this propensity to cry in general. Life satisfaction. So it's reversed in some ways. Like the more lifetime partners you've had, the lower life satisfaction you're reporting. The more more partners in the past year, the lower life satisfaction you report. So that stays significant. The asterisks indicate significance, and the numbers are below 1. So the more sexual partners you had in the last year, the lower your life satisfaction. However, the more sex women report in the past year, the higher their life satisfaction. What's up with that? We're going to talk about that in a second. But again, sexual abuse, same-sex attraction, and abortion seem to drag down life satisfaction, even when we account for whether they used to be depressed when we first talked to them or not. Okay? So what we're seeing is a sort of fairly stable portrait of significant effects of lifetime sexual partnerships, more recent sexual partnerships, but that those diminish in significance when we look at things that have been brought forward from the past. Same story with ever diagnosed with depression, especially the things that have been brought from your past. And the final dense model you'll have to look at, taking prescription medication, especially when same-sex attraction and sexual abuse. Both of these things remain stably predictive of that. Now, I'm going to explain this one shortly. When we look at these sorts of things, we think, how do you pick apart these things? These are called independent effects, right? The number of lifetime sexual partners controlling for the number of sexual partners in the last year, controlling for the frequency of sex. But people don't really actually experience these things distinctively, right? It's packaged into a unified, lived-out whole, right? We have people who have a short-term partnership and then go on to a longer-term partnership. People who have sex occasionally, but then they enter a relationship and then it's fairly frequent, right? How do you account for these kinds of things when you're just pulling people into these separate individual effects? Well, so I decided, let's look at these in terms of types. Let's pick apart people, both men and women, into types, okay? So we combine both in terms of how many partners they've had in the past, how many of the partners they had recently, whether they're in a current relationship right now, and how much sex they're having in those relationships. Okay? So we basically built a model, it's not a model, I should say, built a series of types, right? Virgins who are not in a relationship, right? When I got to college, I was a virgin and I was not in a relationship, okay? And then I was a virgin in a relationship. Then we look at people who have had 1 to 2 previous partners, but none in the past year, okay? People who have had a past, but have nothing going on in the present. And we look at the same thing, people who haven't had a past, and they are in a current relationship, which is sexually active, and I put a frequency of sex 30 times a year. It's like 2 or 3 times a month, okay? So people who have had a past 1 or 2 partners, they're not in a relationship, that third row, and people who are actually in one. They're alike on every other way, except one is in a relationship that's lasted a year, okay? I mean, the Casses have been married for 40 some odd years. You know, when you're 19, you can't be married for 40 some years, but you can be in a relationship for a year, and that seems like a little while, right? So we're going to look at people who have been in a relationship a little while, okay? The same thing with people who have had 5 to 9 partners, 2 to 3 in the past year, but not currently in one, that fifth row. 5 to 9 lifetime partners, and they're currently in a relationship that's lasted a year. If you get my picture, I'm trying to look at people who are in relationships that last a while now. Same thing with 10 plus. So we see when we do this, men, the depression scores bounce around a little bit. Virgins in a relationship seem to have the lowest depression scores, except for people who have had 1 or 2 lifetime partners and are currently in a relationship. But if you look at each of these for men and for women, you keep seeing that the people who are in a relationship currently report better health outcomes than the people who've had the same number of partners in the past but aren't in one right now. Okay? It's interesting. So even the sort of most prolific people, right, 10 plus in their lifetime, the people who are in a current relationship seem to have a lower depression score than the people who've had 10 plus partners, they've had several in the last year, they're not in one right now. They report higher depression scores. So, what do we do with this? This suggests somehow that it's not the sex per se that's the emotional problem. In fact, the sex is operating like it tends to bond and deepen relationships and foster greater interpersonal intimacy. One of our interviewees complained about the bad sex that often characterized her previous relationships. Her grievances, to me, made good sense. Biologists note that the hormone oxytocin is released during orgasm in both sexes. Inside the brain, it's involved in social recognition and bonding. It may also contribute to the formation of trust between people. It's the same hormone that's released in breastfeeding, and activity obviously bonds mother to child. Mutually pleasurable sexual relationships generate more orgasms, more oxytocin, more bonding sentiments, intentions, and emotions. It's not that orgasms can't be had in uncommitted relationships. They certainly can. But such relationships are inherently more fragile than romantic ones. They really can't be stable, given what we know about sex. And you can bet that women end those relationships more frequently than men. A no strings attached relationship is really, really hard for women to manage successfully. So the sex per se is not often the problem. The problem, I always say, is the context of the sex. Uncommitted sex can propel a person into subsequent sexual liaisons, pursuing the short-term high that it almost inevitably comes after the low. A minority largely appears able to avoid emotional problems. Exactly how that happens is not entirely clear to me, but it's certainly true that some emerging adult women exhibit a set of personality characteristics that shield them from the pain that other women feel. It's also social. Some women will see other people seem to navigate such relationships fine, and they'll think, oh, well, I should be able to do that too. They find that they themselves cannot. So what have we learned? NSA. It's become an acronym now. No strings attached. It's almost universal in sexual scripts in emerging adulthood, but it's very difficult in reality. Sex that follows real commitment, not just a simple declaration of exclusivity, we know is far more rewarding. It's an ironic thing that many people who seek sex without strings in the hope that it won't complicate their life and generate emotional vulnerability get exactly that. They get complicated feelings and hurt. Helen Fisher, I think she's an anthropologist, wrote, "Many young adults have had sex with just a friend and never fallen in love. But it can happen, perhaps because increasing activity of testosterone associated with the sex drive can elevate the activity of dopamine, one of the neurotransmitters that we associate with romance. Hence, teens and young adults who have sex with just a friend are biologically susceptible to falling in love." Now, another interesting study says women may be particularly vulnerable to falling in love with a casual sex partner because seminal fluid also contains dopamine and tyrosine, a building block of dopamine. This is from an interesting study that evaluated women's emotions after having sex with condoms and without condoms. I don't know how you get that by the RB, but they noted that women who had sex with condoms exhibited poorer emotional health and just less distance and less romance in the relationship than women who had sex without condoms. These are unmarried women, I believe. Another Michigan State study of sex-only relationships, non-romantic, tended to note that they actually have little passion, and yet these associations stir the same sorts of fears that haunt real lovers, namely that one person will fall harder than the other. So, we see a scenario then in lots of emerging adult relationships that we could already see in those slides. Sex apart from security can be fun. I've had interviewees who say it's actually better than sex in relationships. But minimally, we know it contributes to awkward moments, to uncertainty, to anxiety over the status of the relationship. And that anxiety will either lead to persistent lack of clarity about its status, which people dislike, or to they clarify it, or to conflict over what is the status of this relationship. And relationship conflict in the absence of security often seems more easily dealt with by just ending the thing. Shelby was an 18-year-old from New York, one of our interviewees, very independent, very confident, classically competitive young woman. She was making reference here to the universal experience of conflict in relationships. Yet barring a more secure form of a relationship, she felt little impulse to make things work. Notice that her remark here is actually deferential to marriage. Marriage is a big deal. I didn't feel like we were a married couple, but marriage is a big deal, and that's where and when conflicts really have to get worked out. But a late teen relationship, she thought, is not marriage, and so there's no pressure. Other people don't fare nearly so well as Shelby. When we asked Sean, who's a 22-year-old from Alabama, if he ever thought he had hurt anyone emotionally, he knew the answer. He said, "Yeah, that one I left." We were okay, how did you know that? He said, well, I broke up with her. That was my freshman year, and I was partying a lot and doing some drugs and things, and I was kind of in for the ride. And I broke up with her, and she cried a lot. She was really sad. I could tell it. This was a sexual relationship. Now, what that young woman does next, what she thinks and what she does, is the pivotal thing, right? Does she respond to this rejection, to this breakup, and say, this is how relationships go. This is what they're like. And so then she moves into a new relationship, sort of more hardened to the emotions of it. Or does she say, this is not how relationships were meant to be, right? It's sort of a pivotal moment for her. So why is this a woman's struggle more than a man's struggle? So we see not only do, and this is a sociologist actually, not only do females, I like to call them women, experience pubertal changes earlier than males, they also bring more intimacy-related skills to relationships. And the status and identity of females typically depends on their success with relationships, especially romantic ones. In some ways, this is saying that relationships is a domain for a woman to master, and she gets more satisfaction from mastering that relationship than men do on average. But we're sort of in a new era now. A new era which has been both great to women and hard on women. It's great on them economically and in terms of your career options. Okay? Women later this year will make up more than half of the workforce. It's amazing. But it's been hard on them relationally. The old sexual economy, we're seeing a new transition to a new one. The old sexual economy where men pursued women has given way to fertility control, imbalanced sex ratios on campus, and a diminished economic cost to sex. Right? So when the costs of sex are largely emotional, men do not bear these costs. Women bear these costs. When the cost of sex is not very physical, nearly so much as it's emotional anymore, that economists would say would lower the cost of sex. Right? That once upon a time in the older sexual economy, and we heard this a little bit last night, when sex is risky to women, they extract more things from men in order to get access to it, right? Well, it's not the case anymore, right? When men are flourishing in the marketplace and control their fertility, the price of sex obviously goes lower, and men know it. And men say, well, you have no reason to say no to this. I also said imbalanced sex ratios, right? I just said women now are about to make up more than half of the workforce in the United States. On campus, we see this radical shift. 60 years ago, there was 250 men for every 100 women on campus. Today, there's 75 men for every 100 women on campus. And that's not just some sort of neutral change. That shifts power dynamics in relationships. The person who is the rare commodity generally gets what they want. So, apart from any ideals about this, sex functions for many, not for all, but for many, to compel them to deepen the relationship with marriage as a goal. If sex didn't bond, we'd see a more precipitous decline in marriage than we're already seeing. Right? 90-some-odd% of American emerging adults still want to get married. That's a good thing. Okay? If sex didn't bond, and we know that from the data that 90+% of people have sex before they marry, if it didn't bond, then we would see even a more precipitous decline in marriage. It still works in that way. There's this great line in C.S. Lewis's Magician's Nephew, where the witch eats the fruit that will make her live forever. And the children complain about this to Aslan, and Aslan replies, the fruit always works that way. That's its nature. It can't not do that. She'll get what she wants, but she may not like that. So, it begs the question to me, and I come at this sort of as a little bit of an economist, even though I'm not an economist, is there such a thing as rational sex? Can we speak of a rational versus an irrational approach to sex? Can we apply the idea of rational choice to an action that we tend to consider out of the realm of rationality? Which would suggest that relational sex is more rational, right? We certainly see it's more rational for women and their emotional health, but could it be rational for men? And if so, why aren't more men pursuing relational sex as rational? Now, for women, adding relationships, as we saw earlier, is destructive in itself, especially the severing of relationships. But it also heightens the possibility that they're going to meet and have sex with somebody who's not willing to negotiate sex in such an egalitarian manner as they had expected. It's a problem. Now, why don't more men prefer rational access to sex? I mean, in one sense, it is easier, this is a logic I make, given that men seek sex, on average, to secure it from a stable source than to try one's chances on the free agent market, right? I mean, it's theoretically more rational to say, I want to access it from a stable source than to say, I want to try to access it from unstable sources. It's not unlike why professional athletes tend to favor long-term contracts with a small market team over a shorter-term contract with a popular club in a big city. But The free agent market remains a ready draw. The cost of sex in the free agent market, generally speaking, is low. And there's also sources of competition. Not only is the free agent market readily accessible, we have the availability of high-quality digital porn, which you'll learn about this afternoon, and masturbation. Masturbation's been around forever, right? But in the era of high-quality digital porn, I don't know how they did this study, but I read it not too long ago. They found that sort of the sperm quality and masturbating to high-quality digital porn is categorically different and more intense than regular masturbation, which means that it's more of an attraction to men than it used to be. Right? Masturbation has always been an option, but it's perceived as a better option than it used to be, right? And when it's perceived as an alternative to sex, access to which women control, the price of sex goes down, and it makes it harder for women to get what they want in relationships. I had a student in my UT relationship study who talked about this. He said, if I had to give up porn or sex with real women, I don't really know which one I'd choose. But masturbation doesn't really cut it either. It relieves pent-up sexual tension, for sure, but it's hardly the same sense of emotional connection as paired intercourse. There's a reason for that. Somebody else did research into orgasms, notes that prolactin, a hormone like oxytocin that diminishes arousal and provides sexual satisfaction, is released following intercourse at a rate 5 times that following masturbation. Thus, intercourse we know is more satisfying than masturbation, something most adults already know but couldn't quite explain. Now they have an explanation. Finally, what is sexual health? I frame this sort of conversation about sort of arguments that are flying out around universities, but also sort of the World Health Organization about what exactly is sexual health. It's a term that we hear a fair amount on campus. I'm observing several things about it. Number one is it's insufficiently exact, right? It's sort of this generalized term, but that gets diminished because it's just very broad. There's a bias always towards physical risks in sex, right? Sexual health has to do with physical risks. And I'm saying here to say, well, there's a good reason to include emotional risks in there too, right? But we also don't see that emotional risk shared equally among men and women, so it doesn't really make sense to say there's this broad idea of sexual health that is gender neutral. There's even talk about rights, sexual rights, whatever it's, the right to sexual health, like the right to a good 3-course meal. I don't really know what that means. It doesn't make sense. Finally, we have the sort of domain of sexual health education. I'm actually a good friend with the sexual health educator at UT. We both have a very strong interest in data and knowing what's going on. But one of the key things that distinguishes she and I, she has ready answers to people who are interested in sex and sexual health. And I keep saying, now, Julie, you have to think about the context of this relationship. Is this relationship good for people? Should they do this, right? She doesn't even ask those questions. Sexual health educators generally don't ask those questions, whether a relationship should exist in the first place. They just think, given that people wish for this relationship, what is my responsibility? Hinges on sort of equality norms about between the sexes, which doesn't even make sense given what data I showed today. And finally, we see there's just a genuine institutional disinterest in problematizing sexual choices at all. And hopefully we'll hear about that some more this afternoon when we talk about sexual health on campus. All right, I think I better stop there, and happy to take your questions.
I wonder if you could answer one question. When you were doing the comparison of people in relationships and not, it sounded as though the data was showing that sex is less harmful if it's in a so-called committed relationship.
Right.
And how would you respond to somebody who would take that to say, see, as long as it's someone special, you know.
The problem, yeah, I understand that.
Yeah.
The problem is that what people understand as special and sort of as long term is generally doesn't work out that way, right? So even in a sort of a simple association, we see that frequency of intercourse, and when we know nothing about the relationships or how long it's lasted, etc., seems to be neutral on emotional health. And then I fall back on the sense of, well, sex works to bond people, right? And if people didn't like it, they wouldn't do it, right? And if they didn't like the feeling, if they didn't like sort of some of the feelings that emerge from it, they wouldn't do it, right? So it works the way it's sort of intended to, right? It's the context, and we, the people, who sort of screw it up, right? You know, it's intended for a long-term secure relationship that doesn't end, right? Women feel that more than men, and they you know, that's just the long and short of that. I don't know if that quite answers your question.
Yeah, well,
so it's a mixed bag. You might want me to say, oh, all these people are having disastrous sex lives. And that's just not the case, right?
No.
But some kinds of relationships, and we get some cues about the bonding nature of sex. Some kinds of relationships just are categorically better for people's emotional health than are others. And we also see that, especially in college, people who sort of decide to, you know, not pursue the route of relationships that are either virgins in one or not in one tend to have better emotional health than most other types. It's that entering and exiting thing that just tends to screw people up big time.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to look here at some of the. Let's see.
I'll take anything.
Okay. How about? Okay, someone says.
You're being
Okay.
kind of picky.
Okay. How can you talk about men's attitudes about sex without making them out to be animals driven by instinct?
Say that the first
Yeah,
part.
the person says, how can you talk about men's attitudes about sex without pretty much saying at the same time that they're simply animals driven by instinct?
Right. I mean, we're not animals driven by instinct. We have. It's obvious people have sexual desires and libido and things like that. I say to my students, you know, if we all acted on our desires all the time, what a crazy wreck of a society. We wouldn't even have society, right? If I acted on the sexual desires I feel, I would wreck my life really quick, right? So there's, at one sense, there's something natural to the sexual desire, but there's also something that requires restraint. So when I show these slides, people say, well, men get off easy. And I think that's actually sort of not the right way to think about this. People are complementary, right? People bring different things to relationships. And when people try to do relationships on other people's terms, or when men try to play relationships on women's terms, or vice versa, especially, it just doesn't work out very well. So the whole, you know, it's natural or we're animalistic instincts. You know, one of the things that I have this sort of love-hate relationship with the evolutionary psychologists. They're saying some things that are making sense, but they're also sort of, they fall back on this idea that, oh, this is natural, people will just do this, right? And as a sociologist, I think, well, desire is natural, but, you know, acting on desire all the time, no, there's tons of restraint, right? Appropriate restraint.
Here's one. How would you respond to a feminist who argues that women face more emotional consequences of sex because of a socially constructed double standard, which labels promiscuous women as sluts and makes them feel guilty,
right,
whereas men have more partners and.
Can I have that one? Well, it's quite a. Right. I'm a sociologist, but I'm not into the social construction of everything. You know, what we're seeing here is evidence that there's gender essentialism at some level, right? That women don't just feel like men or act like men. One of the things that's interesting to me as you observe the educational system is like when you're in K to 12, everybody's trying to get boys to act like girls. And then it seems like you go to college and the thing gets reversed and we're encouraging women to act like men. I don't get that. So how would I respond to a feminist who argues that women face more emotional consequences? Well, part of it is that you can't really, feelings happen, right? People manage their feelings, but they come from, they're not socially constructed. What you feel is not really socially constructed. So back to the labels, promiscuous women as sluts and makes them feel guilty. Actually, I think guilt precedes some of these things, both for men and women. And the double standard, right? So here's one thing that's a bit controversial, but I think just the data bears it out. There will always be a double standard in the domain of sexuality and sexual behavior because it's rooted in biology, it's rooted in economics. Who bears the most risk for sex? Women or men? There's an existence of the double standard. It can't go away. We have tried to reduce it, right, by fertility control, things like that. But it can never completely go away, right? And so when you see the talk about sluts and other words, there's no male version of those things that sort of captures it because of this sort of this persistence, right? The double standard diminishes when we get women to act sexually more like men. And we sort of know that men aren't going to act sexually, generally speaking, more like women. So the double standard has diminished over time, in part because of changes that women have made to their sexual behavior. So no, I don't think it's a socially constructed double standard. I think it's an essentialist double standard. And I don't say that in a way that approves it. It just is, right? Is that good?
Well, going back to biology, when you were saying that, I know Dr. Miriam Grossman has through her study made the point that yes, because with women in particular, sexual intercourse does release this oxytocin in great quantities, which makes
more
them
than men, yeah.
that bonding,
Right.
which they can't help but feeling bonded. Yet at the same time, they know intellectually they're not truly bonding because this is not
Right.
a permanent thing,
Yeah.
and that kind of creates
Right.
a divide.
Right, and women feel that more poignantly than men on average.
So I guess in a sense that would be a little bit of a scientific. Could that be considered a scientific explanation for their higher rates of depression than men?
Mm-hmm. Sure, yeah.
Okay.
I think there's all sorts of reasons, and it goes back to sort of the act of intercourse itself, right? We see that intercourse doesn't lend itself one way or other to emotional health, but when we clarify like what their current relationship status is, how long it's lasted, whether they're in one or not, then we can start to see that these things sort of matter. Security lends itself to greater emotional health, security in relationships, right? Which is why, in another life, I tend to push marriage a little bit younger ages than people tend to think about it, because I think security is good for people, and it's especially good for women.
Because also, is there data in addition to this ever done among younger married people to show the rates of happiness and depression among younger people who are married versus, younger people who are not, but engaging in sexual
I don't
activity?
offhand know on that. Early marriage, the first few years tends to be no cakewalk in general because people are forging things in a marriage, forging things together, and I just think it's an easier cakewalk than taking it when you're 35 or 45.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Someone says, could someone refute your research based on the following?
Never.
Based on the following argument. Emotional health is contaminated by the effect of religion in our culture. Your connection to sex partners and depression, same-sex attraction, depression, etc., would go away if society didn't have the repressive, self-hateful influence of irrational religious dogmas. How would you
Just don't think so. This is sort of nationally representative data, and the college experience is the sort of lowest religious point in a life course. People don't expect a whole lot of people in college religiously. I've talked to religious kids, I've talked to irreligious kids, and this stuff works no matter. I didn't talk a whole lot about religion in here, in fact, very little. The same sort of process works whether you're religious or not. I think they might intensify emotions, and it might intensify perceptions about what I ought to feel and what I ought to do. But here we're looking at a portrait of people regardless of religion. And on average, they're not very high religiosity at this point. So I would say the data itself suggests that religion is not driving this sort of emotional health hand-wringing.
One common criticism of sociological data on the subjects like marriage and sex is that they flip cause and effect.
Yep.
How do you prove that, for example,
Good.
women are depressed because of their sexual behavior rather than engaged in certain sexual behavior because they are depressed?
That's an excellent question. I do think it's a two-way street. One of the other scholars who's analyzed this data, especially during adolescence, actually suggests it's 11 times more likely to go in the way that we're talking about it than in the other direction. So that she said it more strongly than I do, that it's usually sex driving emotional health rather than the other way around. But I'm content to say this is a two-way street as well, because in my sort of conceptual model, things that have happened to people in the past, decisions that they've made around sex, sort of they bring that forward, and so it does shape not only their previous emotional health, but also sort of their sexual decisions that in turn. So these things sort of cascade. I'm perfectly content to say it's a two-way street. I don't think it really changes much about sort of the larger interpretations that for when you see these things happen, you are also more likely to see this set of particular pain.
Are there any data on virgins who have broken off relationships repeatedly? In other words, do these breakups hurt just as bad as breaking sexual relationships repeatedly? How do we know the variable is intercourse?
Right. I have not seen that data. I don't know that it exists. I would hazard a guess that it can't hurt as bad. I mean, if we're talking about multiple sexual relationships being severed, I can't imagine. I mean, having been on those relationships where you're between two virgins where they end, they're painful enough. I recall that, but it probably can't compare to the sort of the brokenness. And I get a lot of in the interviews, sort of this one fellow who I had already quoted. She is just crying her head off because he severed this relationship. What I do hear a lot is sort of first sexual relationships for women when they come to an end, and many times they do. There's this sort of a fairly powerful set of emotions that emerge, and that's why I said this person now has this chance to sort of go in this direction of saying no more of this craziness for me. I'm going to hold out for a secure relationship that will not last. I'm going to charge a high price for sex, a ring in marriage. Or does she decide, this is how it is. This is how relationships go, right? So does she decide that I just got to get in line with the popular script out there, or do I say, no, enough of this nonsense. I can't take this. So.
Okay. Someone writes, I have read that the biggest factor in male depression is failed relationships. How does this fit in with data in your study?
I'm not familiar with that one. I'm not going to doubt it. I just failed relationships tend to emotionally harm them less, or it's certainly not in these kinds of sort of depression diagnoses, antidepressants, life satisfaction kinds of ways, right? They can get worked out in others. I have data and interview data about men who have experienced relationship trauma, or men who wanted the relationship more than women. And I'm not here to paint this sort of monolithic picture that all men are dogs and don't care about women and vice versa. But on average, over a population, of 18 to 23-year-olds, these are the sort of the trends that you see.
You know, that brings a question to my mind. Since we know that the tendency among men can be, you know, they more give into that sort of locker room bragging and such, how can we be entirely certain that when they're responding to surveys like this and they're saying, oh, I have, you know, I'm perfectly happy,
Sure.
I have no problem.
Yeah.
How do we know that's just not bravado and
Right.
you know?
Well, I mean, the bravado thing would not extend throughout the population of men. So this sort of leans on the fact that we've got, you know, 4,000 to 5,000 men responding, and basically, you know, so it's not as if in the tables that no men report depression. Some do. It's just it's not associated across a population with these sorts of sexual outcomes.
Someone wants to know, what are the ramifications of women's relative willingness to adapt to new sexual norms, especially in this age of pornography? Sorry.
They're huge. I tend to say that men are the problem and women are the solution, which is, it's kind of it's troubling in some senses, right? Men's sexual behavior is more stable and predictable in all manner of ways than is women's. When I try to predict men's sexual behavior, you get very few significant predictors, apart from age. The older they get, up until, what did I say, 30? Maybe 35. That their sexual behavior is much less plastic than women's. So the changes we've seen, sort of the changes culturally, the changes economically, have been in women's domains, right? So along comes the birth control pill, and I'm not stating yay or nay about it, but it has had unintended consequences. It freed up women to control their fertility. At the same time, it basically gave the power over sexual relationships to men who could no longer say, well, there's no risk here anymore, right? So women have adapted to these new norms, right? And one thing I tend to say is that the cartel has been broken. Right? Companies want to fashion cartels and monopolies so they can charge the maximum price that they would like. Okay? I think on average, women would like more commitment for sex. I think that's pretty obvious. But the cartel is busted, right? I think it got helped along by the pill, but it also, in terms of women's success in the marketplace, we're not arguing about that, and it's a good thing. That no longer do women need to rely on men for making money, for access to a good life, right? So when that is the case for women, they rely less on men for those things than they did 100 plus years ago. So what a sexual relationship and marriage sort of becomes is a little bit more different, a little more fragile, a little more about volition and choice than it used to be. So I do think there's a lot of adapting that's going on, partly because the cartel is broken. Women can have sex apart from a secure marital relationship, and plenty will. And the more that do, the more that it makes it difficult for you to charge a higher price, the price that you want to get, right? Marriage, for a sexual relationship. It doesn't mean it's impossible. There's a lot of factors that affect your ability to charge a higher price, but it makes it more difficult. And you know, so the porn thing is, like I said earlier, it's not like porn has never existed, but it's in more wider circulation now, of course. And it's not like masturbation never existed. That's the sort of the undercutting cost, right? It's just that high quality digital porn is more erotically exciting than your own imagination, generally speaking. So that's the age of porn. It's sort of further driven down the cost and makes it one more thing that pushes that cost down, makes it one more thing that's harder for women to get security and commitment from men.
I think you probably, with that response, pretty much answered these next two questions, but I'll just put them out there if you have anything to add. One is, what is the correlation between the feminist movement or even radical feminism upon traditional campus relationships? your talk about the birth control pill sort of spoke to that a little bit. And the other is how to respond to women who say that sex and sexual freedom is a source of female empowerment. Again, what you say sounds pretty much the,
It's a mixed bag, and I think some share of feminists are starting to, and I'm not taking a position on the movement. I mean, there's been various waves of the movement, some I've been more on board with than others. I think they have realized that there is, that you cannot have it all, right? There are trade-offs in sort of empowerment. It's one of those things as a sociologist, I don't mind saying, it's like it's an unintended consequence. When we do certain things and there are certain technological innovations and things like that, they outpace our ability to deal with them morally, ethically, emotionally. And so some things are just, we didn't expect this to happen, but look, it has happened. And so, I mean, I'm pleased the sexual health educator that I get along well with at UT, much more liberal than me, but she also realized, I mean, she sees these unintended consequences too, and I think that's fairly rare among sexual health educators on campus. So I'm pleased that we can speak the same language. She's actually become somewhat hostile to the birth control pill, not because she wants to disempower women's fertility control, but because she's like, it messes with women's bodies sometimes, and it's not for everybody. And so it's been a mixed bag, and I think feminists are starting to notice that. Some people would like to ignore it and say, no, it is, or say it is worth the costs, and some of them are saying that.
Very good. What have you found to be the most effective way to respond to the person who says that experimenting with sex is just natural?
Just natural. Again, back to desire is natural. Experimentation. The thing is, it's funny. There's another chapter in this next book that's about sort of, I call it red sex, blue sex. It's about political culture and how. I grew up in rural northern Michigan. A lot of sort of conservatives who didn't go to college. Very prolific sexual actors, but sexual experimentation for them was sort of you got rid of that by the time you were like 20, right? And among the blues, it doesn't even start until at least 20, generally speaking, and it goes on for a longer period of time. Anyways, experimentation means different things in different people's minds. Reds don't think of same-sex experimentation. Blues might tend to think that. They both want the same goals. They actually still want to get married and have families and things like that, but between now and then, a lot of different ideas about this stuff. Well, it would beg the question. I was told the other day that my use of begging the question was inappropriate. So that raises the question: what they mean by experimentation. When I think of experimentation, I think of small children discovering their genitals and things like that. Not 20-year-olds.
Is there a noted emotional response?
Noted?
Noted. I didn't say that. To the capacity for the creation of life in unprotected sex.
Sometimes I need to look at it again. Noted emotional response. Noted emotional. I'm not totally sure what they mean by that.
I guess maybe do people
do they respect it? Do they understand it? I think.
Is it perhaps maybe the question is there a difference in the emotional response to sexual relationships if it is known that they are using quote protection? Or
right.
not?
So there's this study I mentioned that found that women who have unprotected sex in the sense of no condom have a different sort of emotional response to it, better, generally speaking, than people who have sex with condom. There's a lot of questions, raises a lot of questions underneath what that means, what is the nature. Did that relationship drop the condom because they were certain that nobody had an STI, or she had a pill, etc.? There's a lot of stuff about that, but one thing I've noticed is a sort of a generalized antagonism among emerging adults that sex actually has to do with conception of life. I think people would like it not to be true, especially in that period of time. I know when we had a third child, we were at a fertility specialist, and the assistant was like, it's kind of funny. You're in your 20s in college, and you try not to, you do your best not to get pregnant, and here you are in your 30s, and it's the other way around. I think there's a sort of a sense of, we don't want it to be true. We don't want this to generate life. But back to sort of the Aslan notation, Aslan quotation, it is about that. It wouldn't be good without that, even though I think a lot of people in their 20s would like to ignore that. I ask my students, when does women's peak fertility begin? They're all overestimating, 22, 25, runs till 35, 40. And I say, no, I mean, it starts at, peak fertility starts around age 20, only lasts for about 8 or 9 years, and then starts a slow decline. And people seriously just don't want that to be true. They want to sort of separate the two physically, hormonally, mentally, and we're the worse for that.
Have similar studies in regard to sexual activity and emotional health been conducted in other sexual cultures such as Europe, Asia, or Africa?
No, not that I'm aware of. Maybe some in Europe. Yeah, some in Europe. I cite a Danish study, I think, a Norwegian study, but nothing very comprehensive. Data in Africa is hard to get. We've done a project on religion and AIDS in Malawi. Data collection in Africa is a difficult thing to do. Let alone on sex. I mean, it's. I think in America we've become open enough to talking about it that I can get quality data for people, especially when we're sitting talking interviews. But data on sex in Africa would be subject to what we call a high degree of social desirability bias, telling you what they want you to hear.
Last question I have here is, given that sexual scripts are becoming more and more permissive, what is the role of internet media and online dating in sexual relationships?
It's a great question. Internet media has radically democratized sexual knowledge, so it's like a bad source in the sense of everybody can say whatever they want online, and you get the impression, it's like diagnosing yourself online, right? You look up a few symptoms and you're sure you have cancer. There's all sorts of information out there, and things posed as information, and people who look like they're enjoying random crazy sex that is exploitative, etc. And so it's a radically democratized picture, right? It's not edited at all. It's not subject to sort of peer review. So I think the internet will tell you whatever your itching ears want to hear. The second question was
Role
online.
of internet media and online dating.
Online dating and sexual relationships. Yeah, the online thing. Last night, the cast has talked about it briefly. I'm ambivalent about it. I understand. If I was out of college, I probably would be doing this too. If I couldn't find a good woman at church. The problem with online dating is it creates, on the bright side, it creates a ready pool that you otherwise didn't have, right? Because it used to be you got out of college and you're like, oh no, where am I going to find this person? So now you can find them in some ways. One of the unintended consequences about it is mental, it makes people more picky, right? It's sort of, gee, this person wasn't exactly what I thought they'd be like. Anybody else sort of, you go back home after the date and log on, like, did anybody else sort of say they'd like to meet me? I knew this fellow who, or one of my students knew this fellow who wasn't interested in a long-term relationship, but had become addicted to the high of being desired online, right? So he would go on these dates, they would go nowhere, he wasn't intending them to go anywhere, they didn't even become sexual, right? It was just that he so much craved the sort of initial attention of somebody saying, hey, I like you, right? I would like to get to know you. Wow, that was this sort of, craved this high. So I think one of the problems with online dating is that it creates this sort of idea, it sort of goes along with sort of the hookup idea in the sense of there will always be somebody else. This one does not have to work out, right? And 20 years ago when I met my wife, as an 8-year-old, no, I'm actually 38. 20 years ago when I met my wife, I was operating in a pool that was more closed and with less options than I see people perceive their options today. I remember going to college, and then I sort of honed on a small number of women, and I didn't perceive my pool as being really large, right? Different men will perceive their pools in different ways, but I didn't have you didn't have people sort of coming into your life saying, hey, I want to be your friend, hey, what are you doing, hey, and it also involved this sort of the cold call or the cold ask, right, which develops some relational skills that are good. Now people sort of conduct relationships beginnings and ends online or over text, like, hey, you want to do this? No thanks. Well, that rejection was a lot easier than the ones I had to endure when I was younger, right? So I can complain about that, but that's not going away, right? It's sort of, we have to figure out how to operate and to keep that in mind in this sort of new environment of relationships whose security from the start seems more fragile than it used to be.